You know how you've got like a bunch of different Bible versions, like on your shelf or even just on your phone?
Yeah,
Ever wonder why that is? I mean, it's just one book, right?
that's exactly where the deep dive begins. It might seem like one book, but
Right?
it's a book that's been translated more times than almost any other text in history. And that's not even counting all the different languages it's been translated into. So today we're going to unpack some of those translation choices so that you can have a better understanding of what you're actually reading when you open up the Bible.
Okay, that makes sense. But isn't it just a matter of like just finding the right words in English for whatever the original language was?
Oh, I wish it were that simple. We're talking about ancient Hebrew and Greek
Oh, wow.
languages that have evolved significantly over time. Plus, think about the culture and context that those texts were written in. Imagine trying to explain like 21st century slang to someone living 2,000 years ago. It'd be nearly impossible.
Whoa. Yeah, good point. It's like trying to translate a meme or something. Just
Exactly.
wouldn't work.
Yeah, it just wouldn't work.
So where do we even start with all of this?
Well, the journey begins way before any of the Bible versions we know today even existed. Think
Really?
scrolls, not bound books, and languages that have evolved significantly over time. We're talking about ancient Hebrew for most of the Old Testament and Greek for the New Testament.
So how did they even figure out what those ancient texts said in the first place? Like, how do we even know what we're reading now is even close to what was originally written?
That's where things get really interesting. We have some amazing artifacts like the Dead Sea Scrolls
Right?
that give us these little glimpses into the transmission of these texts over centuries. They're like a time capsule, helping us understand how the Bible was copied and preserved over time.
Okay, so we've got these ancient Hebrew and Greek texts, and thanks to things like the Dead Sea Scrolls, we can be pretty confident that we're reading something close to what was originally written. But how did we get from that to all these Bibles we have today?
Well, for a long time in the English-speaking world, it was all about the King James Version, the one from
Oh
1611.
yeah, the KJV, I've heard of that one. That sounds super old school.
It is old school. So King James the First of England commissioned this new translation that was based on a specific Greek text called the Textus Receptus.
Hmm, I see.
And this King James Version reigned supreme for centuries, shaping how countless people understood and interpreted the
But
Bible.
it wasn't the end of the story, right? Like, we've got all these other translations now.
Exactly.
Why was there a need for anything else?
Well, two major things happened. First, scholarship just kept advancing. And scholars found new manuscripts and started to realize that maybe this Textus Receptus that the King James Version was based on wasn't actually the most accurate representation of the earliest texts. And the second thing that happened was that language changes. So the English of Shakespeare's time
Right.
is pretty different from how we speak today. So it's not surprising that people wanted a Bible that they could understand more easily.
So they started making new translations. Were they just trying to, like, be more accurate than the KJV?
That's where we get into this whole debate between word for word translation and thought for thought translation.
Okay.
And it's not a simple question of accuracy, but rather different approaches to translation. Some translations like to stick as closely as possible to the original languages,
Hmm.
even if it sounds a little awkward in modern English.
I could see how that would be tough.
Yeah.
So what's the thought for thought approach then?
That's about trying to convey the meaning of the text in a way that modern readers can easily grasp, even if it means, taking a few more liberties with the actual wording.
Okay.
Think of it like this. If you were trying to translate a joke from another language, you wouldn't just translate the words literally.
Yeah.
You'd want to capture the humor and make it funny in English, right?
Right. Yeah, that makes sense. So which approach is better?
Well, there's no easy answer there. Both approaches have their strengths and weaknesses, and a lot depends on what you're trying to achieve. Some people really value that close connection to the original wording, while others prioritize readability and just being able to understand it.
Okay, so different translations, different goals.
Yeah,
It's more than just finding the right words in English.
it's way more than that.
But how do we know if a translation is even good? Like, are there any red flags we should be watching out for? That's a great question. It's easy to get overwhelmed with so many choices, Like, how do you know which translation is right for you?
I think a good place to start is to ask yourself, what are you actually hoping to get out of reading the Bible? Like, are you doing some kind of in-depth study, or are you looking for something for your personal reflection or your devotional time?
So you might use a different translation depending on what you're doing.
Exactly. If you're really trying to dig deep into the original meaning of the text and all the nuances, then a more literal translation like the ESV might be a good fit. But for, your daily reading or your devotional time, something like the NIV or the NLT that prioritizes readability might be be a better choice for you.
Okay, that makes sense. It's like if you're a chef studying a classic French recipe, you want the original version. But if you just want to, make a tasty meal at home, a simplified version might be more helpful.
Yeah, I like that analogy. And don't be afraid to compare different translations as well, because seeing how different versions actually render the same passage can really highlight those nuances and
Hey.
give you a deeper understanding.
Okay, so multiple translations are a good thing. But back to those red flags. Are
Yeah.
there any translations out there that we should just steer clear of?
I'd say it's less about specific translations being like bad and more about just being aware of potential biases, right? Because every translation is going to reflect the theological perspectives and priorities of the people who created it.
Can you give me an example of that?
Sure. Take the New World Translation, which is used by Jehovah's Witnesses. It's known for certain renderings that support their specific doctrines, like how they translate the word cross. So
Okay.
you have to kind of know who's behind a translation and what their goals are to a certain extent.
So it's important to know who's behind a translation and what their goals are.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
It's all about being an informed reader.
Yeah.
So, do your research, read reviews, and maybe even check out some sample passages just to see if a particular translation resonates with you.
This is all really helpful. I feel like I'm already starting to see the Bible in a new light.
That's great.
But what about those really tough parts to translate?
Yeah.
Idioms or metaphors?
Yeah.
How do you even begin to translate something like it's raining cats and dogs into another language?
That's a great question. Those figures of speech can be some of the biggest challenges for translators because the goal is to convey the intended meaning.
Right.
But it can get really tricky when you're dealing with cultural references or expressions that don't have direct equivalents in other languages.
So how do they decide what to do?
Well, sometimes they'll use a footnote to explain the original idiom, or they might paraphrase it in a way that makes sense in the target language. But it's a delicate balance between um, preserving that original flavor of the text and ensuring that modern readers can understand what's being said.
I could see how that would be a tough call.
Yeah.
What about the cultural context? Does that ever cause problems for translators?
All the time. Remember, the Bible was written in a very different time and place
Right.
than our own. So translators have to grapple with all sorts of things like social customs, political systems, even, clothing and food.
Hmm. Can you give me an example of how that plays out in a translation?
Sure. Take the concept of headship in the New Testament. In the ancient world, the head of the household had a very specific meaning tied to authority and responsibility. But that doesn't necessarily translate neatly into our modern understanding of family dynamics.
So how do modern translations handle that?
Well, some translations stick with that literal term head, while others use words like leader or authority. And that choice can significantly impact how people interpret those passages and apply them to their own lives.
Wow, I hadn't thought about it that way before. So even small differences in translation can have a big impact on our understanding of the Bible.
Yeah.
What's the takeaway here? What should we as readers kind of keep in mind?
I think the takeaway here is that reading the Bible isn't just about taking the words at face value, right? It's about understanding the context, the history, and the translator's choices.
Right.
And being aware of these things can help us engage with the text in a more, a deeper and more thoughtful way.
It sounds like there's a lot more to think about than just, grabbing any old Bible off the shelf.
It's true.
So are there any tools or resources that can help us navigate all this complexity?
Oh, there are some fantastic resources out there. Dictionaries and lexicons can shed light on the meaning of specific words in the original languages. And there are even online tools that can offer side-by-side comparisons of different translations.
Wait, you can compare different translations online?
Yes.
That sounds incredibly helpful.
Yeah, it is. And you can even look up specific verses or passages to see how different translations, handle them. And it can be a great way to just see the range of interpretations out there
Mm.
and get a deeper understanding of the nuances.
Okay, so we've got these tools and resources to help us along the way,
Mm-hmm.
but I imagine it can still feel overwhelming,
Sure.
especially for someone who's new to all of this.
Yeah.
What advice would you give someone who's just starting to explore different translations?
My advice would be don't be afraid to experiment. Try out different translations, see which ones resonate with you, and don't worry about finding the perfect one right away. It's a journey of discovery, and there's always something new to learn.
That's encouraging to hear. It sounds like there's no need to be intimidated by all the different versions out there.
No, not at all.
But what about this idea that some translations are like deliberately trying to mislead people or change the message of the Bible?
Okay.
Like how do we know which ones to trust?
It's important to approach this topic with both sensitivity and clarity. The vast majority of Bible translators are dedicated scholars who are really just trying to make the text accessible
Right.
and understandable to modern readers.
So it's less about deception and more about just different approaches to translation.
Yeah, exactly. Of course, every translation is going to reflect the translator's understanding and interpretation of the text,
Right.
but that doesn't necessarily mean they're intentionally distorting the message, right? It's more about recognizing that different translations might prioritize different things like readability, accuracy, or a particular theological perspective.
So how can we as readers kind of discern those different priorities and make informed choices about which translations to trust?
That's where it becomes crucial to look beyond the translation itself and do some research on the people and organizations behind it, right? Like, what are their stated goals? What are their theological leanings? Are there any known controversies or criticisms associated with their work?
So it's kind of like checking the credentials of a doctor before you go see them. You want to make sure that they're qualified and have a good reputation.
Exactly. And just like with doctors, there are resources available to help you vet different translations, right? There are websites, books, and articles that offer reviews, comparisons, and analyses of various Bible versions, highlighting their strengths, weaknesses, and potential biases.
So informed engagement with the Bible requires not only um, understanding the nuances of translation, but also like doing some homework on the translations themselves.
Precisely. It's about being an active and discerning reader rather than simply accepting, whatever translation you happen to come across.
Okay. I'm getting the sense that choosing a Bible translation is a lot more involved than I initially realized.
It is.
It's not just about like finding one that sounds good or looks pretty on a shelf, right?
It's much more than that.
Okay.
It's about finding a translation that aligns with your needs, preferences, and goals as a reader. And it's about recognizing that every translation is a human endeavor subject to the limitations and perspectives of the people who created it.
This has been so insightful. I feel like I've learned so much already.
I'm glad you hear that.
But before we wrap up, I have one last question. You mentioned earlier that even like small differences in translation can have a big impact on our understanding. Can you give me like a concrete example of that, like a specific verse where the translation really matters?
Absolutely. There's a great example in Matthew 18:11.
Okay, Matthew 18:11. What's so special about that verse?
Well, in the King James Version, it reads, "For the Son of Man is come to save that which was lost." But in many modern translations, that entire phrase is just missing.
Wait, what? A whole phrase just disappears. How is that even possible?
It all goes back to those manuscript variations we talked about earlier, because scholars now believe that this particular phrase was likely added later and wasn't part of the original text of Matthew.
So the modern translations are reflecting the most up-to-date scholarship
Exactly.
by omitting that phrase.
Precisely. And you can imagine how that one small difference in translation could have a significant impact on how people understand the verse and its theological implications.
Wow, that's a powerful example of how translation choices can really matter. It makes you wonder how many other verses have those kinds of nuances.
It's true. That's the beauty of it. There's always more to explore, more to uncover, and more to learn about the Bible and its rich history of translation.
This has been an incredible deep dive. I feel like I have a whole new appreciation for the complexity and depth of the Bible, and I'm definitely going to be paying closer attention to those translation choices from now on.
Yeah, it makes you realize there's so much more to reading the Bible than just like picking up any old version and assuming it's, like the straightforward word of God.
Right. It's not like a simple instruction manual or something.
Right.
It's so much deeper than that. I never thought about it that way, but that's a great analogy. So where does this leave us? What are some practical steps we can take to choose a translation that's right for us?
Well, first, I'd say think about your reading style and your goals, right? Are you looking for something that's easy to read and understand, or do you want a translation that stays a little closer to the original languages, even if it means a little more work on your part?
So it's kind of like choosing between watching a movie with subtitles
Yeah.
or with a dubbed voiceover, right? Like sometimes you want the full impact of the original performance, and sometimes you just want to like follow the story without having to read everything.
That's a great way to put it. Yeah, and just like there's no right way to watch a movie. There's no right Bible translation.
Right.
It all depends on what you're looking for. So if readability is your priority, translations like the New Living Translation or the NIV are known for their clear and contemporary language. But if you want something that sticks a little closer to the original Hebrew and Greek, the ESV or the NASB might be good options.
So we've got that readability factor. What else should we consider?
Well, think about the purpose of your reading too. Are you doing like some in-depth study,
Okay.
or are you reading for personal reflection and devotion?
Hmm.
Because for study, you might want a translation with more footnotes and cross-references like the Net Bible or the Reformation Study Bible. But if you're looking for something for devotional reading, a translation with more poetic language like the New King James Version or the RSV might be a good fit.
Okay, so we've got readability, we've got purpose. This is feeling a lot less overwhelming now that we're breaking it down. Anything else we should keep in mind?
Yeah, the last thing I'd say is don't be afraid to consult multiple translations,
Okay.
because seeing how different versions render the same passage can be incredibly enlightening. You
Yeah,
you might pick up on nuances you hadn't noticed before,
right.
or even discover new layers of meaning that you hadn't seen before.
It's like getting a second opinion from another doctor.
Yeah.
If you're not sure about a diagnosis, it never hurts to get a fresh perspective. So we're encouraged to kind of shop around,
Yeah.
think about our reading style,
That's
and
it's like
compare different translations.
yeah, definitely.
Any final words of wisdom before we wrap up this deep dive?
I think the most important thing to remember is that the Bible is a living, breathing text. It's not just a collection of rules or doctrines. It's a story, it's a poem, it's a love letter from God to humanity.
Hmm.
And just like any great work of literature, it deserves to be read carefully, thoughtfully, and with an open heart.
Beautifully said. It's so easy to get caught up in the details and the debates,
Yeah.
but ultimately it's about connecting with the heart of the message. This deep dive has been so eye-opening. I feel like I have a whole new understanding of the Bible and how to approach it,
I'm glad to hear that.
and I'm definitely going to be putting all these tips into practice.
Me too. And I hope our listeners feel empowered to do the same. Remember, engaging with the Bible is a journey, not a destination.
Right.
There's always more to learn, more to explore, and more to discover within its pages. So keep reading, keep questioning, and keep digging deeper into the richness of this incredible text.
Well said. And on that note, we'll wrap up this deep dive into Bible translations. We hope you've enjoyed this journey of discovery, and we encourage you to continue exploring the fascinating world of biblical translation.
It's a fascinating world.
It is. Thanks for joining us.